There is a single sentence in the private diary of America's most celebrated general that he hoped no one would ever read. He wrote it in the first days of 1945 in his own hand about something his own men had done in the snow, and for the better part of 80 years, he very nearly got his wish. You came here for a story about dog tags. About a German soldier, and a chain of American names hung around his neck like a hunter's trophies. That story, the one in the title, is a myth, but the truth underneath it is stranger and colder and far harder to look at than the legend ever was. It runs through a frozen crossroads near a Belgian town called Malmedy. It runs through a young SS colonel named Joachim Peiper, and it ends in a field on the edge of a village called Chenogne, where a column of men stood with their hands raised and were cut down anyway. The men who set up those machine guns were not Germans. They were American soldiers, men of the Third Army. The army commanded by General George S. Patton. Picture that field for a moment because we are going to return to it. Knee-deep snow, cold that hurts to breathe. A line of German soldiers, rifles gone hands in the air. Some of them are boys, 17, 18 years old. A few are medics holding up strips of cloth marked with a red cross. Under every law of war ever written, these men are supposed to live now. In front of them, Americans are setting up the guns. This is not the story the newsreels told. You know the other one. The general who spun an entire army 90 degrees in the dead of winter and drove north to rescue Bastogne. The cigar. The ivory-handled revolvers. The legend that says when the line broke, one man refused to lose. All of that is true. It happened. It is worth remembering. But this happened too. And Patton knew. And what he chose to write about it tells you something about war and about men that no monument ever will. To understand how it came to that field, we have to go back 2 weeks, to the morning the whole front came apart. December 16th, 1944, the Ardennes, along the border of Belgium and Luxembourg. This is the quiet sector. The worn-out divisions come here to rest. The green ones come here to learn. Nobody expects an attack. After Normandy, after the long summer of victories, the war feels almost finished. At 5:30 in the morning, the forest erupts. Adolf Hitler has gathered more than 200,000 men for one last gamble in the West. Tanks, artillery, whole armies moving under fog so thick the Allied aircraft cannot leave the ground. The plan is to tear the American line apart, race to the River Meuse, and seize the great port of Antwerp before the winter ends. At the point of the northern attack rides the 6th Panzer Army. Its commander is an SS general named Sepp Dietrich, 52 years old, once Hitler's personal bodyguard and chauffeur, a blunt, brutal man whom his own senior officers privately dismissed as loyal but limited. Under Dietrich leading the fastest armored column of the entire offensive is a 29-year-old SS lieutenant colonel named Joachim Peiper. Peiper is handsome, decorated and cold. He earned his reputation on the Eastern Front, where his unit left burning villages behind it. Now he carries one order that outranks all the others. Move fast. Do not stop. Let nothing slow you down. Not even prisoners. Far to the south, the news reaches a general who has spent his whole life waiting for a moment exactly like this one. George Patton is 59 years old, profane, theatrical, a man who studied war like scripture and spoke about killing with an appetite that unsettled even the officers who admired him. Where others see catastrophe in the German breakthrough, Patton sees the opening of his life. And here is a thing about Patton that happened just a week before all of this that tells you exactly who he was. In the first days of December, before a single German tank moved, Patton's Third Army was stuck. Not in the Ardennes, but to the south in the region of Lorraine, drowning in mud. Weeks of rain had turned the ground to soup. His attack had stalled. And so on the 8th of December, Patton picked up a telephone and called his chief chaplain, a priest named James O'Neill. He did not ask for a prayer for the safety of his men. He did not ask for mercy or for peace. He asked for a prayer for good weather, so the killing could go faster. The chaplain hesitated. He said, as gently as a man can say such a thing to George Patton, that it was not usually the custom of his profession to pray for clear skies, so that men could kill other men more efficiently. Patton did not care. He wanted the prayer and he wanted it printed and he wanted a copy in the hands of every soldier in his army. 250,000 cards. And in the middle of December they went out. A small card, a prayer for fair weather on one side, Patton's Christmas greeting on the other. Sit with that. A prayer to God printed 250,000 times, asking for the clouds to break so the dying could resume. 2 days after the last of those cards was distributed, the Ardennes exploded. Now the weather that Patton had cursed in the Lorraine mud became the thing standing between him and history. Because while the High Command was still measuring the scale of the disaster, Patton was already bent over a map proposing something that sounded impossible. He would take his Third Army, which was facing east, and swing it 90 degrees to the north. Tens of thousands of men, trucks, tanks, and guns. He would drive them straight into the flank of the German attack, in the snow, on frozen roads, within days. At a grim meeting with Eisenhower and the Allied commanders, Patton said he could strike north in 72 hours. The room went quiet. They did not believe him. He did it anyway. But there was one enemy Patton could not outflank: the sky. The same fog that shielded the German tanks also chained the American Air Force to the ground. The men surrounded in Bastogne could not be resupplied from the air, and every mile of Patton's advance was paid for in blood he could not spare. And then around the 23rd of December, the skies opened. The fog burned off, the planes came, supplies and bombs fell out of a clean winter sky, and Patton, who had ordered 250,000 prayers, for exactly this took it as proof that God fought on his side. The prayer he had written for the Lorraine mud passed that week into legend. On the 26th of December, his tanks broke through the ring and reached Bastogne. In the newsreels, this is the triumph. This is where the story is supposed to end. The hero rides to the rescue and the music swells. But 9 days before those tanks reached Bastogne, at a crossroads far to the north, something had already happened that the newsreels would never show. Something that was moving through the American ranks like a fever. December 17th, the second day of the offensive. A snowy junction near the Belgian town of Malmedy at a place called Baugnez. A small American unit gunners of an artillery observation battalion is caught in the open by Piper's column. They are lightly armed. They are outnumbered by tanks. They do the only sane thing. They surrender. The Germans herd them into a field. Roughly 84 American prisoners, disarmed, standing together in the cold with their hands up. And then, for reasons never fully explained, the machine guns open fire. Men fall in heaps. Some are only wounded, and they lie still, faces pressed into the bloody snow, praying not to be noticed. It does not save all of them. German soldiers walk among the bodies afterward, and where they hear a groan or see a chest still rising, they finish it. A pistol to the head, a rifle butt to the skull. A handful of Americans break and run for the tree line under the guns. A few of them impossibly live. They stagger into American positions with a story that sounds too monstrous to be real. But it is real, and it will not stay contained. Word of Malmedy tears through the United States Army faster than any tank ever moved. It passes from foxhole to foxhole, and as it travels, it changes shape. Grief becomes rage. Rage becomes something colder. In more than one American command, unofficial orders begin to circulate. Take no SS prisoners. Shoot them where they stand. The massacre in the snow has just lit a fuse, and that fuse is burning toward the field at Chenogne 2 weeks away. But there is one more thing about that same day, the 17th of December. And it is the part almost no one told for the next 50 years. While Piper's men were murdering prisoners at Baugnez, other soldiers of that same S division came upon 11 American gunners a few miles away near a tiny hamlet called Weret. These 11 men had also surrendered. They too had put down their weapons and raised their hands. They were black soldiers from a segregated field artillery battalion. They were not simply shot. When their bodies were found weeks later, after the snow melted, the wounds told the story of something slower and crueler. Broken bones, bayonet wounds, brutality inflicted before death. And here is the part that should stay with you. Malmedy became a symbol. It filled the newspapers. It would lead to one of the largest war crimes trials the United States ever held, dozens of SS men in the dock. The nation demanded justice, and it got a courtroom. Where it got silence. A report was filed and buried. No trial. No headlines. For decades, the 11 men murdered at Weret were left out of the story of the Battle of the Bulge almost entirely. Their deaths unmarked. Their names unknown to the country they died for. Two atrocities. The same enemy. the same frozen day. One remembered as a national outrage, the other quietly erased, before a single German prisoner was executed at Chenogne before Patton ever wrote that sentence in his diary. The American war had already made a choice about whose deaths would count and whose would not. That is the ground we are standing on. A general who prays for weather so the killing can go faster. An army carrying a wound that is turning into a weapon. And a machinery of memory that has already decided which of the dead the world will be allowed to see. The fuse is lit, the rage is loose in the ranks, and in 2 weeks in a field outside Chenogne, it is going to find a column of men with their hands in the air. The question is no longer whether Americans are capable of a massacre. The question is what their most famous warrior will do when he learns that his own men have committed one. To understand what happened at Chenogne, you have to understand what a soldier carries in his chest after he hears about Malmedy. Not in his rifle, in his chest. Picture the American front in the last week of December 1944, the coldest winter in living memory. Men sleeping in holes scraped out of frozen ground, their feet rotting inside their boots, their rations frozen too hard to eat. They are exhausted in a way that goes deeper than the body. And into that exhaustion drops the story of what the SS did to 84 disarmed men in a field near Baugnez. It does not arrive as a report. It arrives as a whisper, then a rumor, then a certainty. Passed man to man down the line. And with every retelling, the details grow sharper and the anger grows colder. The men who heard it were not lawyers weighing evidence. They were tired, frightened, grieving young men who now believed one simple thing. Surrender to the enemy, and the enemy will line you up and cut you down. And a belief like that changes how a man fights. In more than one American unit, orders began to move that no one wrote down. No prisoners, especially no SS. If they come out with their hands up, do not take the chance. Some of these were spoken aloud by officers. Some were understood without a word. But across the Ardennes, an unwritten law was taking hold, and it had nothing to do with the rules printed in any manual. This is the first thing to understand about the road to Chenogne. The most dangerous weapon in that forest was not a tank or a machine gun or the cold. It was rage. And rage had just been handed a justification. Now, while that fever spreads through the American ranks, something else is moving through those same frozen woods. From the very first hours of the offensive. Something that will make every American even more paranoid, even more willing to shoot first. Because word comes down the line that the enemy is no longer only wearing German uniforms. They are wearing ours. His name was Otto Skorzeny, 36 years old, a tall scarred Austrian with a dueling gash carved across one cheek and the most feared commando in the German military. A year earlier he had snatched Mussolini off a mountaintop in a daring glider raid. Now Hitler had given him a stranger mission. It was called Operation Grave. Skorzeny gathered German soldiers who spoke English. He dressed them in captured American uniforms. He gave them American jeeps, American weapons, forged American papers. Their job was to slip behind the American lines, in the chaos of the first days, switch road signs, cut telephone wires, spread panic, and seize the bridges over the Meuse before the real Germans arrived. Here is where the legend that brought you to this story quietly falls apart. If you have heard the tale of a German found wearing the identity of dead Americans, a chain of stolen names around his neck, this is where that image truly comes from. Not from a trophy hunter, not from a monster counting his kills like antlers on a wall, from spies in stolen uniforms. The men of Operation Grave did not wear American identity as trophies. They wore it as a disguise. It was a deception meant to buy a few hours of confusion at the most desperate moment of the war. And when it failed completely. Some of Skorzeny's commandos were stopped at American checkpoints and caught out by the smallest things. A sentry would ask a question no impostor could answer. The home city of a baseball team, a slang phrase, the capital of a state back home. Men who spoke flawless English but had never lived an American life gave themselves away with a single wrong word. Under the laws of war, a soldier captured fighting in the enemy's uniform is not a prisoner of war. He is a spy. The ones who were caught were tried within days and stood against a post. Photographs survive of them in their stolen American jackets tied to stakes moments before American rifles ended it. They died in the uniforms they had put on, and the law that killed them was clean and simple. They had chosen deception over the honor of their own flag, and they had no protection left. But the damage was done. Word of the impostors raced through the American army like electricity. Suddenly, every unfamiliar face was suspect. The man walking toward you in a GGI uniform might be the enemy. Even generals were stopped at gunpoint and grilled about football and film stars before their own sentries would let them pass. An army that already feared surrender now feared its own reflection. Paranoia layered on top of fury, and every layer made it a little more likely that when frightened men next met the enemy with his hands raised, they would not pause to sort the innocent from the guilty. The rage was loose, the trust was gone, and now into that poisoned air comes the thing that gives this whole story its terrible weight. Because if you strip away the myths, there is a real story about American dog tags in this campaign. And it is not about a killer wearing them as jewelry. It is about how a nation identifies its murdered sons. For nearly a month, the crossroads at Baugnez, where the Malmedy massacre happened, lay behind German lines. The bodies of those 84 Americans stayed where they had fallen. And that brutal record-breaking winter did something that would matter enormously. It froze them. It preserved them. It kept the crime exactly as it had been committed under a blanket of snow. On the 13th of January 1945, as the tide of the battle turned, American forces finally retook that ground. And what they found waiting for them in the field was a frozen record of exactly what had been done. Teams moved carefully across the snow. This was not only a burial, it was a crime scene, and every man there understood it. The dead were photographed where they lay. Each body was numbered, examined, and identified. And the identification came in large part from the small metal tags around their necks. Their own dog tags: name, serial number, blood type, faith. This is the real role those tags played in this story. Not hung on an enemy as a boast. Read off the bodies of the dead one by one so that a mother in Ohio and a wife in Pennsylvania and a father in Texas could one day be told the truth of what happened to their boy. And the frozen dead told that truth without a single word. The medical examiners who studied them found something that turned grief into a legal case. Roughly 20 of the men had a single close-range gunshot wound to the head, a deliberate shot fired into men who were already down. Others showed the same. Some had been beaten to death with rifle butts, their skulls broken. These were not the wounds of a battle. There is no version of combat that leaves this many men with a bullet placed carefully behind the ear. Each tag became a name. Each name became a case. Each case became one more count in the indictment that would one day put dozens of SS men in a courtroom. So hold these two images side by side, because the whole meaning of this story lives in the space between them. On one side, German commandos hanging stolen American uniforms and papers on their bodies to deceive and to kill, treating the identity of American soldiers as a costume to be worn. On the other side, American graves, teams on their knees in the snow, lifting small metal tags of frozen bodies with something close to reverence, using them to give the dead back their names. The same idea. Two opposite meanings. One is how you erase a man. The other is how you refuse to let him be erased. And here is the question that has been waiting under this entire story, patient and cold. The American army has just spent a month learning in the most personal way imaginable exactly what it means when surrendered men are murdered and left in a field. They have photographed it. They have measured the execution wounds. They have read the names of the dead with their own hands. They know better than any army on earth in that winter precisely what this crime looks like and precisely how much it must never happen again. They know all of it, and now hold that knowledge in one hand, because in the other, a report is already climbing the chain of command. A report about something that happened on the first day of the very same January, in a field outside a village called Shenogne. The men who knelt in the snow to name the murdered are about to become the murderers. That is the collision this whole story has been driving toward. Not Germans against Americans. Something far harder to look at. It is what men become when they have seen the worst and then decide the worst has given them permission. And standing above all of it, about to be handed a report he will not want to read, is the most famous general of the war. New Year's Day 1945. The village of Shenogne, a few miles west of Bastogne. The fighting here has been savage. House to house, room to room, in a village that changes hands more than once. The Americans, pushing through, are men of the 11th Armored Division. And here is the first thing you need to know about them because it changes everything. They are new. The 11th Armored had reached the front only days before. Most of these men had never seen combat until that week. They had not been at Malmedy. They had not stood in the field at Baugnes. They had not lost a single friend to Piper's machine guns. What they had inherited was the rage, the whisper that had traveled the whole army. The unwritten law that said the SS take no prisoners, so neither should you. They arrived already carrying a hatred handed to them by men they had never met, for a crime they had never witnessed. And on that first morning of the new year near Shenogne, that inherited rage met a column of Germans coming out of the ruins with their hands up. Now hold on to what you learned about that frozen crossroads because this is the cruelest turn in the entire story. The men being marched into that field were not Piper's SS. They were not the murderers of Baugnes. They were ordinary German soldiers of the regular army from an escort brigade and a Panzergrenadier division, some of them boys. And among them, medics waving strips of cloth marked with the Red Cross, the oldest signal in war that begs an enemy to let a healer live. The men who massacred Americans at Malmedy would face a courtroom. These men would face a machine gun in the snow, and they were not even the same men. The Avengers had found the wrong people, and they killed them anyway. An American sergeant named John Feig was there in Company B of the 21st Armored Infantry Battalion. And unlike almost everyone else who witnessed what happened, he did not stay silent. He wrote it down, plainly, without excuse. He described watching prisoners marched up a hill. He knew what was coming. He said he hated it. He watched the machine guns being set up in the fields, on both sides of the road, 25 or 30 German prisoners in each group. And he understood in that moment exactly what his own side was about to become. His words survived, and they land harder than any narrator ever could. He wrote that they were now committing the very same crimes they had been accusing the Germans and the Japanese of doing. Read that again. From an American soldier who was standing right there. The same crimes, his own side, in real time. The guns opened up, and somewhere between 60 and 80 surrendered men fell dead in that field on the first day of 1945, executed by soldiers of the United States Army. This is the moment, the one this entire story has been walking toward, and now the report of it begins to climb up through the chain of command toward the desk of the man whose army had just done this thing. George Patton kept a diary, a private one. In it over the years, he had recorded his triumphs, his grudges, his contempt for rivals, his hunger for glory. It is one of the most revealing documents any American general ever left behind. And in the early days of January 1945, Patton made an entry about the killing of prisoners by his own men. He did not express horror. He did not demand a court-martial. He did not call it what his own sergeant standing in the snow had called it. He wrote that there had been some unfortunate incidents in the shooting of prisoners. And then he wrote one short line that tells you everything about how such things were handled. He wrote that he hoped they could conceal it. Conceal it, not investigate it, not punish it, not confront it. Conceal it. The most celebrated fighting general America produced in that war, writing in his own hand that the murder of surrendered men by his own soldiers was a thing best hidden. And if you think this was a single lapse, a moment of weariness in a hard winter, the record says otherwise. Because Patton had done this before. Go back to the summer of 1943, Sicily. In the fighting near an airfield called Biscari, American soldiers of Patton's 7th Army executed dozens of Italian and German prisoners in two separate incidents on a single day. Disarmed men gunned down. When one of his commanders, Omar Bradley, brought word of it to him, Patton's response was already familiar. His own diary from that time records his advice. Tell the officer to certify that the dead men were snipers or had tried to escape, because otherwise it would cause trouble in the press. Manufacture a story. Dress murder up as something lawful. Make it go away. That was 1943. This was 1945. Different country, different season. The same reflex. This is the man the newsreels turned into pure legend. Not a monster, not a coward. a brilliant driven commander who could turn an army 90 degrees in the snow and save a besieged town, and who also believed down in his private pages that when your own side commits an atrocity, the task at hand is to conceal it. Both of those men were the same man. That is the hard truth. Greatness, and this can live inside one human being, and pretending otherwise is how a country lies to itself. So what happened to justice for all of it? For Malmedy, America built a courtroom. In 1946 at Dachau, dozens of SS men stood trial. 43 were sentenced to death by hanging Joachim Peiper. Among them, Sepp Dietrich, the general who commanded them, was sentenced to life in prison. That was the promise. And here is what became of it. Not one of those death sentences was ever carried out. The verdicts were challenged, the interrogations questioned, the political winds shifted as a new war with a new enemy began. The sentences were commuted, then reduced again. Sepp Dietrich walked out of prison in 1955. Joachim Peiper, the man whose column murdered those men in the snow, walked out in 1956. He lived as a free man for another 20 years until someone finally came for him at his home in France in 1976. That was the justice for the crime the world was allowed to see, now Chenogne, for the murder of 60 to 80 surrendered German soldiers by American troops. There was no Dachau. There was no courtroom. There was no trial at all. After the war, when questions were finally raised, the investigation went nowhere. The unit's records were said to be unavailable. The division had been broken up, the men scattered back into civilian life. The answer that came back in effect was that the war was over, and there was no point now. Not one American soldier was ever charged for what happened at Chenogne. Not one. The men who set up those machine guns in the snow went home, raised families, and grew old. And the field where they did it stayed quiet for decades. And the 11 black soldiers murdered at Wereth on that same December day as Malmedy, they waited more than 50 years for even a small stone to mark that they had ever lived and died at all. So here is what this story leaves in your hands. The same act, men with their hands up, cut down in the snow. When the enemy did it, we called it a massacre, and we built a courtroom, and the whole world learned the names. When our own men did it, our most famous general wrote that he hoped we could conceal it. And for the most part, we did. None of this erases what those young Americans endured in that forest. The cold that killed, the friends lost, the genuine horror of Malmedy that lit the fire. All of it was real and all of it deserves to be honored. But honoring men does not mean lying about them. The men who froze at Bastogne were heroes. And some of the men in that same army, in that same winter, did a thing that has no honor in it at all. Both are true. A grown man can hold both without letting go of either. That is the whole point of looking back with clear eyes instead of a flattering myth. Not to tear down the men who won that war, but to see them whole, to understand that ordinary decent people, pushed far enough, grieving hard enough, frightened enough, are capable of becoming the very thing they hate. And that the line between the soldier and the war criminal is thinner and colder and closer than any of us would like to believe. Sepp Dietrich went free. Joachim Peiper went free. No American ever answered for Chenogne. And the most quoted warrior of the age wrote a single sentence in his diary that still echoes. He hoped they could conceal it. They did not conceal it forever. It took 80 years, but here we are saying it out loud. And maybe that is the only justice still available to men who have been dead for generations. To finally be seen exactly as they were. All of them. The murdered in both fields. The heroes and the killers who sometimes wore the very same uniform. The truth at last with nothing hidden. Nothing.